QSO Today, Episode 413, Connor Black, W4IPC, and CJ Pokowitz, WW0CJ, on Youth in Ham Radio. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. A few notes before we get started today. Nuts and Bolts magazine has joined the QSO Today podcast as a weekly sponsor. We want to thank them for supporting the QSO Today podcast. We now have over 40 exciting presentations for the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming September 17th and 18th. Tickets are on sale now for this event. Based on the advice of my guest today on the podcast, we will offer a free ticket to qualified youth under 18 years of age and students. If you have a project that you'd like to share in the expo without preparing a speaker presentation, then look no further than our new project gallery. That includes self-service kiosks for your paper, article, poster, video, and downloadable content. This is a great way to share or seek attention for your project. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. While at the Dayton Hamvention last May, I ran into Connor Black, W4IPC, a former speaker at the Expo, and CJ Pokowitz, WW0CJ, in the Flex booth. They expressed an interest in being on QSO Today to discuss ham radio issues and today's youth. Not having done a show like this before, I thought there is a lot for us old-timers to learn from and about ham radio youth, defined as humans interested in amateur radio under the age of 26. If we want a future for ham radio, we need to better understand our youth and how we need to position our hobby so that it rings their bell. My eyes and ears were opened in this QSO Today. Be sure to check out the show notes of this episode for a copy of the survey that Connor and CJ mention in this QSO. WW0CJ and W4IPC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, guys?
4Z1UG, this is WW0CJ.
Well, Connor and CJ, I want to thank you both for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. My introduction kind of tells how we met and put this together, but when we were talking before we started, you mentioned that in preparation for this podcast, you created a poll. Can you talk a little bit about the poll that you did, and perhaps in my questions and our conversation tonight, that you'll actually hit on answers that come from that poll?
Yeah, so around a month ago, we put out a poll to a few youth communities online, specifically our remote ham radio youth program, which we'll hopefully touch on a little bit later, and some youth-specific clubs. Just asking, what brought you into the hobby as a youth and who is influential to you, and a few other questions just sort of about what could bring new youth into the hobby. So hopefully we can base some of our answers today, not just on our own experiences, but on a broader community. We ended up with over 100 responses on this poll, so...
Connor, do you have something that you'd like to throw in on top of that?
It's just a quick 6 short answer poll, so, everybody responded quite well to it, and we posted it to, like Colin said, all over youth communities, and also the largest ham radio Discord server. We had it posted there, so there's tons of good responses to touch on.
I'm just going to warn the audience that my questions are based on my being in ham radio 50 years and completely not understanding today's youth, just as I probably felt as a youth that I wasn't understood by anyone at all. So I'm begging the forgiveness of the young people listening because the questions might seem naive on the one hand. On the other hand, hopefully I'm reflecting a generation of ham radio operators who truly love the hobby, and we want youth to come in so that we can pass this amazing hobby down to you. So by way of introduction, and I think maybe, CJ, we'll start with you. Could you talk a little bit about how you got into the hobby, how old you were, what licenses you hold, and kind of what was the driver?
Yeah, so I got in, I'm currently 19. I got into amateur radio when I was 17, so not too long ago. I found it by way of social media. So I was searching around YouTube and ended up stumbling upon a video. It was actually a video by Ham Radio Crash Course on it was a little bit of a clickbait title. It was called why 1 point something million people can push to talk button, but we can't. And it was all about amateur radio licensing and what you can do on VHF. So I saw that. I thought it was cool. Bought myself a Baofeng, and then studied for my technician license. And sort of the driving force to that was just being able to experiment with new technologies. I'm a big person into general tech and engineering and all that kind of stuff. So I've found it very cool to be able to just experiment with all the different gear and equipment that I can with radio.
That's a great introduction, but I think we'll go down into the weeds here with my questions. Connor, what about you?
All right, so I got started several years ago. I want to say I was 15. It was right around my birthday, so I want to say I was 15 when I started, of course, in high school. And we had a radio club at high school. It was sponsored, and the shack was in the electronics classroom, and the electronics teacher was a ham. And he gave us an extra letter grade at the end of the semester if we got our license, so you know what I did.
It's good to have ham radio operators in schools. Okay, so let's kind of go down to the weeds a little bit here. From the kids that answer the poll and the kids that you have met in amateur radio events, do they fit a profile in terms of their interests, education, support systems, and support to encourage hobbies?
I wouldn't say everyone fits in the same general profile. You'll definitely see a lot of the same interests. A lot of the kids in amateur radio communities that we're a part of, they tend to have the same outside hobbies, right? Like you mentioned earlier before this, a lot of them like to play video games, and a lot of them like to do a lot of other tech experiments outside of amateur radio. But I think one of the coolest parts of youth and amateur radio is you get so many different types of people that you are able to meet. You'll meet, it's like high school cliques, sort of. You'll meet the nerdier kids who like the tech, but then you'll also meet the jock kids, because amateur radio brings something to everyone that we've found in youth.
And what is that universal appeal to amateur radio?
It's just so vast. There's so much you can do with so little.
Well, CJ, I think you said that you got a Baofeng radio when you found ham radio on the Ham Radio Crash Course on YouTube. What was that experience like? I mean, I hear a lot of people, they get the tech license, they get the radio, they get it home. What was that first experience like?
Well, so I actually had a very interesting first experience. Because I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and so I don't know if you remember seeing in the news a couple years ago, there was a large bombing in downtown here to the AT&T building that knocked out AT&T's internet and cellular communications for a few days. And that was right around the same time I had just gotten my tech license and my radio. So I was able to get my first dive in by listening to these emergency communications people that are nearby doing these nets and sort of giving this back and forth on what's happening locally. I think that you just need to get them on the radio, get them listening to something, and sort of that's what pushes people in. I know a lot of people say, oh, I get the radio, and then I don't know what to do next, right? I don't know what to listen to. I don't know where to search for signals. But it's just as soon as you can get them hooked on listening to something, that's when they get the real pull in.
Well, it sounds to me, though, that you might be unusual, because I think that the Baofeng radio, in terms of its programming, is rather complicated. And even if you're semi-technical, then maybe Chirp, which is the program for programming the Baofeng radio, might be a little complex. Do you think that you might be different from the average guy because you may know how to Google the right answer when you've got a pile of tech on your desk?
Potentially. That's definitely a concern. And I think one of the main things we actually heard from this forum is that, there's not a lot of open information and open access to equipment in amateur radio. And that's one of the things that it makes it hard for people to get into the hobby as youths. It's a high cost of entry for equipment, and even the low cost of entry, it's hard to get into it and use it. So one of the things that we really need to work on is, being more mentors and elmering the youth and sort of getting them their first steps in and making that easier on them so it's less a point of frustration.
My local club, I see it happening, right? Everybody has a club meeting, once a month you'll have your board meeting and then you'll have your general meeting, right? and everybody just sits there during the whole general meeting and no one gets on the radios. At least that's my experience here locally with several of the clubs, is no one actually touches the radios. But recently I've been starting to get them to get on the air, and we have a bunch of younger people that come in because I live next to the largest Navy base in the world. So there's always young people that are radio interested coming through. And so at the end of the meeting, I've started dedicating like 30 minutes to just playing on the radios, playing with antennas. And that seems to be really popular. So maybe that's something local clubs could start trying to do. Just get people on the air.
Or bringing test equipment and other kinds of stuff so that if people want to set up their radios and maybe learn how to use them.
Yeah, just show, everything you can do with ham radio. Just bring an oscilloscope and play with stuff and just let people have fun and show what the hobby can do.
So are you saying that many of the meetings you go to are people sitting in folding chairs listening to a panel of older guys talk about the budget?
Basically, it's guys going through a Word document just talking about stuff. And, that's fine and dandy, and that's a necessary part of a club. But we're already at the meeting. It might as well do some radio at the radio club meeting.
That's a very good point. So I think that when when us old-timers were kids in amateur radio clubs, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't email, there wasn't the ability to create a newsletter in 20 seconds and post it online or Discord server to exchange information. We actually went to the meeting for information. Do you think that model's outdated now? That getting together as a group is to do activities, not to listen for information?
For the most part, that's sort of true. Our local club, we have a newsletter that goes out. We send information to everybody every week or so. And even our meetings now are hybrid meetings. We have a big screen in the clubhouse that we play the video participants on. And so it's sort of I think we're in a transitional period on that where it's slowly transitioning into more online.
Well, one of the things I noticed by looking at your profile pictures on QRZ, it appears that you're not adverse to operating older radios. I think anybody that listens to the QSO Today podcast, and this is now episode 413, I must have said 200 times that all of us old-timers have attics and basements full of equipment. All we need to do is find some young ham radio operators that we could give it to in order to clear it out before our children clear it out and throw it into a dumpster. So is this message never coming from other radio clubs? Do old-timers not volunteer equipment?
So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. I think it's a little more rare, but I say that I do have an Ameritron amplifier sitting next to me that a gentleman in Northern Virginia sent to me when I was 16. So there is that. That is a thing. But I think it's slowly becoming sort of rare for that to happen because in the youth's eyes, okay, OMs like to hang on to everything. That's just an opinion. That's sort of the view we have, is that they just like to hold on to stuff. But I do have something that was given to me, so it does happen.
Yeah, what about you, CJ? Do you think that you have the same observation?
Yeah, I mean, there are some people that are willing to sort of pass down equipment, and I mean, we will see a lot of youth operators running older equipment just because it's the best price to get their hands on. But it's not very often that someone will pass things down just to get a youth started. And I think the times that I have heard it happen, that basically changes the whole hobby for the kid.
Because it perhaps comes with an Elmer?
A little bit, yeah. It comes with an Elmer, and it's it's just like that lower barrier to entry is everything we're hearing, is that the easier you can make getting into the hobby, the better. And that is just another barrier easily removed.
Yeah. That's probably, my Elmer probably hates me by now because he opened a door of my shack. Here's the key to my shack. Whenever you want to operate, just come on over. And that was possibly a mistake. But yes, Elmers are a huge help to youth, especially if you could just give them access to stuff, give them knowledge, right? Bring them over, show them how, if you're repairing a radio, invite them over,
But your interest is having your own shack, your own place to do stuff.
That's the end goal.
That's the end goal. So schlepping stuff home from your Elmer's house because he's decided he doesn't need it anymore is not a bad thing.
Oh, no. For us, it is not. However, there is a particular problem. We have parents, right? And they don't like it when you clutter their house. So that's a small problem to get around. But yes, kids love it. And that's another thing we found in our poll is a lot of kids have, stricter parents than some. And so some kids can't even really put up an antenna.
Is that maybe related to living in areas that have codes, covenants, and regulations?
Some yes and some no. I think it's a parent-to-parent basis, but like my parents, I have a vertical in the backyard. I've got antennas all throughout. I've got a Yagi hanging in the trees, and we live in a very strict HOA. But I think it's really down to the parents. I think some more knowledge of the hobby and that it's not just a bunch of weirdos on the air, to the public might also help. A little bit of awareness. I think parents don't maybe understand, what you can get out of the hobby and how fun it is.
I think that many of the kids in my generation, unfortunately, that was a long time ago, our parents had hobbies. My father spent every night in the garage working on cars or some kind of wood project or something. Do your parents have hobbies? And do parents nowadays have hobbies?
Yes, my father loves to bowl. That's his hobby. But yeah, they have hobbies. My dad likes to bowl and play guitar. So I guess he can understand from a certain point of view, right?
Right. So this is Connor replying. And CJ, what about your parents? Do they have hobbies?
Sorta. I think it's a different type of hobby. They're not sort of going out and doing things. My parents are big into like interior decorating and just working on things around the house, and they've sort of made that their hobby, not really the sort of technical stuff.
Right. And so does that hobby clash with amateur radio if the equipment doesn't fit the decor?
Little bit, yeah. Like Connor said, he's got a bunch of big verticals and Yagis in his backyard. I've had trouble even getting basic wire antennas up without it, but trying to maneuver it to fit their bill for what they want the backyard to look like.
Trust me, there is quite a bit of pushback. They do not like the coax running down the siding. I can assure you of that. That's a key point of failure.
Does that make you more clever in terms of trying to disguise what you're doing in order to satisfy the adults in the house and the adults in the neighborhood in order to be able to operate your hobby?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, all my verticals are painted to look like trees. My coax is painted to match the siding. I've made very good friends with the neighbors on either side so that they don't get a little angry. But maybe Colin has some more.
Yeah, I mean, I had to do a lot of research to find various antenna options. I ended up going with a vertical, but even then I'm having to like readjust the antenna and finding ways to even just learn how to quickly bring it up and take it down, just in case and all that kind of stuff.
Do you think that because of being in the amateur radio hobby that you're perhaps more clever? I mean, are you having to solve more problems than you were before?
We're pretty sly. The hobby does create some problems, especially with parents, that maybe don't understand why they have a 130-foot long piece of wire in their backyard. So it makes us a lot more clever on how we disguise things and how we go about our business.
Right, because I guess perhaps to them, if they don't know anything about radio, they're trying to figure out why your cell phone has no antenna. Why does that talk around the world when you need a 130-foot piece of wire in the backyard to talk around the world?
Yes, and why can't they watch TV at night because the cable box turns off on its own?
Do you think that kids today have different challenges than their parents had?
Most definitely. We're in a digital age, right? And our challenges, how funny it might seem, are if our phone is working, and if the internet is down. But when the power goes out and the internet goes down, my parents have no issue. They're just smooth sailing, and it's like DEFCON, big problem for me, right?
So you're very reliant on technology, and that's because you've never not had technology.
Exactly. My radio is a computer, for example. I can't operate it without, I can, but I can't operate it without my computer, right? And so I'm pretty reliant on it, and that's just how things are going now. Colin and I don't really know a world without technology and cell phones and computers.
Does this make it harder for you to find information, or is there some barrier to entry in amateur radio that has been introduced because this generation is so reliant on technology?
Facebook. We could, Colin and I, I'm sure, could get into a whole thing about Facebook, but ham radio Facebook groups are not really the greatest place for us younger people. It seems to be, for lack of a better word, a bit of a cesspool of, Baofeng hate. And just recently, I don't know if you're aware, but there was Meme Appreciation Month. And so our Canadian friend, Ben, and a few of his friends in Canada came up with some really ridiculously hilarious call signs to use on the air, because Canada will give you any suffix you want as long as you pay the money. And there were several Facebook posts condemning the ligma suffix that we thought was quite hilarious, but they did not. And so that causes a bit of friction between, I guess, the OM and the young person.
So, Connor, so that us OMs maybe know what you're talking about, what is a meme?
Oh, boy. Oh, this is a loaded question. A meme is basically anything someone finds, someone young, or I guess anybody finds funny. Of course, on Facebook, there is the popular minion memes that we young people love to hate. Any funny pictures, funny videos, basically funny pictures and funny videos.
So a meme isn't a logo or something like that?
Not necessarily, but it can be. It's a very broad description. A meme is a very broad description.
Have the OMs taken over Facebook in terms of ham radio, and that the young people have moved someplace else?
Very much so. A lot of the OMs, now they haven't really taken over Facebook, but they're the vast majority, and they have the voice on Facebook. But us younger people have now moved to Discord, which is sort of like IRC, I guess you can say.
Right, and IRC was the original chat on the internet.
Yes, and so we've moved to Discord, and there's several Discord servers that we talk on, and it's, more youth-centered, and of course, there's Ham Radio Crash Course Discord, which is the biggest ham radio Discord. It's a mix. There's a lot of youth in there, but there's also a lot of older people in there, which is, a pretty good mix. It's about, I'd say, it's a pretty equal mix, as opposed to Facebook is a vast majority of quote-unquote OMs.
CJ, would you agree with Connor in terms of that Discord is your social media?
Yes, definitely. I spend most of my time chatting about ham radio on Discord. I started out hanging out on Facebook, but then I sort of migrated away. I think that happens to every youth. It's not a place where you stay for a little bit.
Now, I'm curious. It appears to me that Discord, even as a technology, is decentralized, I think, right? So it allows you to continue talking even if you get kicked off, right? Because you can just build another Discord server and move your community there. Is that appealing to young people, over a big service like Facebook or Instagram? The
anonymity that you can get off of Discord seems to be pretty appealing. I've seen a lot of youth that, are mostly anonymous, which is just fine. And that seems to be pretty appealing.
Now, the ham radio kids on Discord, in terms of interacting with the adult population, the OM population of amateur radio, do you find that there's a lot of technical sharing, mentoring, Elmering? Is it possible for a new ham to get on Discord and actually get some help?
Definitely.
There's, like the Ham Radio Crash Course Discord, I hang out there most of my time. There's a lot of good Elmering going on there. There's, dedicated channels for DIYing, and it's not just ham radio related. There's 3D printing channels in there and all sorts of stuff, right? And so it's a really good resource for OMs and younger people to sort of collaborate and just learn from each other. And there's a lot of youth teaching OMs lessons in that channel as well.
And do you find that the institutional amateur radio organizations, without naming them, are they also in this Discord? Do they know where these channels are? And are they reaching out to youth through these channels?
A division of one of them, yes, has their own Discord server. It's not very active, but when it gets around meeting time, it does get pretty active. But they've made somewhat of an effort. But that's the only knowledge I have of them on Discord, is that one server for a specific division.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with ICOM. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RSBA1 app. The ICOM IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution Spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these ICOM rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine ICOM rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. How important is mastering the hobby in terms of understanding, say, one thing really deep, like antennas, for example? How important is mastering the technical elements of the hobby to your generation of ham radio operators?
So it starts out as not very important, right? In our Discord servers, we always get the questions and people trying to get an amplifier before they get a dipole, right? And so we always try and encourage, hey, you really want to get the best antenna you can. So it sort of starts out as not important, but you can see the shift as to where suddenly knowing a lot about antennas and knowing a lot about coax becomes a lot more important almost overnight.
I think the big thing is a lot of people, they come in and it's not an important thing to them, but that's just because there's so much to do in the hobby. They need to play around and explore, but as soon as they find their niche, it's like a switch is flicked on and they instantly want to master that specific niche.
Yeah. There's a kid in our remote ham radio Discord that literally all he does is slow scan TV and he loves it. But that's all he does and that's his thing. Everybody finds their little niche in their hobby.
Has anybody asked him what he thinks is cool about slow scan TV? And by the way, maybe there's some slow scan TV OMs listening who haven't been able to articulate why a young person might actually like that, especially when they can do high definition TV on their smartphone.
I think with SSTV specifically, I that's a good idea, because I actually don't think I've ever asked him for like an in-depth explanation. But I think one of the big things that we notice with a lot of the youth is that they're not the biggest fans of operating HO phone. They find the digital side the most appealing because, you know, you don't have to speak and learn how to communicate and do all the lingo, but you have this way to like meet people and at least have basic discussions. And it's very cool to just be able to hook some cables together and then be able to send out pictures. I think is just bringing the digital world of phones into your own technology and experimentation is a big thing for youth.
And there's another reason I say just for information, I say kids as in, you know, younger people, right? There's another reason we don't want to get on sideband and voice is, you know, take a listen to 80 meters or 7200. It's not very inviting to younger people. I think something could be done by one of the ham radio organizations about behavior on the bands, but that's another topic.
Often the advice that us OMs give to everyone is if you don't like the conversation, you can spin the dial. Do we not have enough bandwidth in order to accommodate everyone?
We do, but the problem is, all right, we're going to get into this. So, how do I put it? Some OMs think they own frequencies, right? They've had their net there for 20 years. We have a net for Ham Radio Crash Course that meets wherever we find spots, but lately it's been getting heavy jamming from places we've tracked down, and we won't name names, but heavy jamming. And, you know, there's a bunch of Ham Radio Crash Courses tailored towards new people, right? It's a YouTube channel. It's totally just a crash course. It's totally new people. So we have a ton of new people on that net. And after the net, you can watch the Discord channel for the net, and people are less than thrilled and pretty put down by just jamming and people talking over our net. And so that seems to be a real problem, is there's not enough, I guess you could say, frequency police, people that sort of stick up and say, hey, you know, move on.
And yet, you guys, have you figured out who are responsible for the jamming and stuff? I mean, it seems to me if you've got a lot of people, you could probably easily find them.
Yeah, there's a really good thing online called Kiwi SDR, and it's got TDOA. I forget what that acronym means, but basically it takes several different web SDRs around the country, can triangulate where the signal's coming from. It's really useful.
When you report these people to the authorities or to the official observers, is there a response? Is there any kind of reply?
Further than automated replies, no. Nothing ever really seems to come of it, but it makes us feel better that we're, you know, at least making them aware of it.
You know, one of the problems, it seems, with groups like Discord and WhatsApp is that hams seem to spend more time on Discord and WhatsApp than they do on amateur radio. Is that something that you guys have kind of figured out how to make that balance so that you're actually on the air?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting aspect to amateur radio, is the off-the-radio portion of ham radio nowadays. There's a huge amount of amateur radio that goes on the internet, never touching the radio, just people talking and experimenting over the internet, you know, on Discord, talking about various things. And I know several hams that barely get on the air, but they are in those Discord channels talking it up, talking about experimentation and all of that, but don't really touch the radio much. And so I guess you could say there's sort of a two-side of amateur radio, the dedicated on-the-air guy and the guy that gets on the air every weekend, every other weekend, but is on the internet 24/7.
Is there encouragement on this Discord channel to get people to come on the air? You have this 80-meter net, but do you create events online in order to pull people off the Discord and onto the air?
Well, there's the net, and we also have a channel where people spot Parks on the Air, and a lot of the users in the Discord are Parks on the Air activators, and so you'll see someone will spot one of the guys that's doing Parks on the Air, and suddenly everybody's talking about what they're hearing on the air, and that seems to draw people onto the air, the Parks on the Air spots in that Discord.
And what about you guys? Do you guys like operating in the field, CJ?
Yeah, I've recently started getting into Parks on the Air. I actually did my first Parks on the Air activation with Connor over when we were in Ohio for Dayton. But I'm trying to get out in the field more. I think that's another thing that's one of those niches that everyone can get into.
Well, the talk of radios are expensive. What is expensive to you guys, and how do you meet those? Do you guys have jobs? Do you have trust accounts? How do you pay for amateur radio?
Yeah, I think me and Connor are the weird minority for youth because we're both that adult age and we both have semi full-time jobs.
Colin and I are lucky.
We're able to afford more gear than most. We meet a lot of youth that are like they end up with a budget of like $200 to $300 to get a whole HF station off the ground, and that's really where the trouble lies.
Yeah, that we're actually. I've been talking to one very recently in our Discord that his budget is like $400, and today's day and age, a radio that you can get for under $400 is not very available, and that's his budget for his entire station: antenna, coax, tuner, radio, and we see that a lot where they just don't have the budget. Like Colin and I, Colin's got a 7300 or whatever. I've got several flex radios sitting in a rack next to me. We're the lucky ones, but it's not like that in reality. Most of the youth don't have any money, and a lot of their parents don't want to buy radio. What do I have to pay $800 for this radio for you, just to do what you can do with your phone that you have, right?
Well, I think the OMs might say that. Well, there are projects like BitTex. There's QRP Labs, and those transceivers, QRP Labs transceiver is under $50. Do those not have appeal to youth?
This is going to be controversial, but in my opinion and several other people's opinions that I'm friends with, QRP isn't the greatest for getting started for kids. It just leads to a lot of frustration, we feel. Calling one guy, calling. It just gets frustrating for younger people. We don't have patience.
And I was going to say, specifically with the QRP Labs, because I actually have a couple of QRP Labs radios, and I personally love them. But I think if you're talking about kids that are just getting started in radio, I think the barrier to entry becomes building that kit. And I think people just want to have something to just get on the air and not have to learn 3 other skills to be able to get on.
Yeah, kit building isn't as easy for new young people as it may seem.
How would you define getting on the air? Is a Baofeng radio on the local repeater getting on the air, or are you defining getting on the air as somehow operating HF?
So for me and our RHR Discord and everything, that sort of the main goal is HF, right? Get the kids on HF, because VHF is fun and all for kids, talking on the repeater, but you run out of people to talk to quick, and you can't, communicate very far. But to get them on HF is the big goal. That's what we really consider, quote, on the air, is getting on HF, talking to people, halfway around the world.
You're talking, say, single sideband, right?
Well, any mode. I mostly do CW now, but yeah, sideband is, of course, for people to talk on.
As the entry level, that would be the entry level.
Yes, that's the easiest first thing you can do is just pick up a microphone and talk. Then you can get into digital and then eventually CW, hopefully.
So then would a very inexpensive or even free, like Yaesu FT101, a 30-year-old radio. I've got an FT101 under the cupboard here. I've got a TS520 that's 40 years old sitting on the desk that I no longer use, and I'm sure that there's a lot of old-timers like me. Those radios would be ideal for a first-timer getting on the air. What do you think about that?
Oh, yeah. I've actually been trying to buy an 0101 for 6 months. But that would be something, experimenty. Of course, a kid would rather have something newer, but as a first radio, it might be okay to start off with something old and just figure out, how stuff works. And eventually down the line, hopefully get something better. Colin?
The big thing is that with the older radios, like I said, a lot of the youth want to go from sideband basically almost straight into these digital modes. So that I think is the only concern that they have when they're looking at HF transceivers is they're like, well, how can I get this to do FT8 or SSTV or et cetera?
Maybe that's even a business if the supply chain isn't broken in that area as well, but maybe that's a business to figure out how to adapt these older radios for FT8, for example.
So, funny you bring that up. You mentioned my QRZ profile page. That's a World War II Iowa-class battleship on my QRZ page profile picture. On that ship, we have a radio club, and in our radio club, we have a 1945 TCS radio transmitter and receiver. I have used that on FT8 with not much success, but it has transmitted FT8.
But the issue, I think, with FT8 is just frequency locking to keep the stability, to keep it right on frequency.
Yes, it's very bad. Very bad. I've never made a contact, but it has transmitted FT8.
When you're transmitting, that must be what we see is that's going up and down the band.
Oh, yeah, it's plus or minus, a kilohertz.
So I'm hoping that what we're doing is we're planting some ideas in the minds of listeners. The profile of the QSO Today listener tends to be older, and I'm hoping that older also means that we're listening and we're saying, well, we could probably get a lot more youth on the air if we cleaned out the basement.
I mean, you can operate FT8 on almost anything. When I was younger, I would just take a speaker from my computer, hold it next to the microphone, and there you go. You've got a sound card, right? So it doesn't take too much to do something like FT8, FT4, just a stable radio.
Yeah, it just becomes a little more difficult. I mean, I think the big thing is convenience, and everyone likes the 7300 or the Flex radios where just a USB cable and you can do digital, but it's definitely doable. It's just not as convenient.
In your survey, now your survey was only 6 questions, so obviously you didn't ask all the questions, but if you were going to guess, how many of the youth on the air own a soldering iron?
Not as many as I would like. Connor, what would you say? I don't know if I could put a specific number on it.
It's a minority.
Yeah.
It's number one, it's dangerous for kids, right? I mean, you got a big hot piece of metal, right? And most parents won't go for that anyway. But it's a skill that's not truly necessary unless you're building coax or building a radio. So for like a young ham, it's not truly necessary to own a soldering iron.
Well, I remember putting a drill through one of my fingers, and my father said to me, "Did the other one still work?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Okay, go clean it up." Do you think that that's an attitude that parents have these days?
Definitely not. I work in a wood shop for my day job, and I'll come home with like cuts all over my fingers and bruises and markings from various mishaps. And my parents definitely have the opposite of that attitude. They're always freaking out and being like, "Are you okay? Do you need me a little more careful?" Da, 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 da.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
If I so much as wear a slightly nice shirt while doing antenna work, I'm going to hear about it for at least half an hour.
Parents now hover more than they did in the past?
Helicopter, yes, definitely.
Do you think that has an effect on the messaging that we send? I mean, we're obviously that generation or older, and we're sending messages out to kids. Do our messages conflict with what's happening on the ground?
So when I was younger, they don't care so much now because they understand now. But when my parents didn't understand the whole thing, and why are all these old men, why are you going to club meetings with all these OMs or old men? It was definitely a bit conflicting until they sort of one day just got it, right? One day they understood what was happening. And so it's a bit of a curve for them to sort of change their thinking of, no, these aren't just weird people. They just like the hobby a lot.
Yeah, and I think you shouldn't be pushing your kids into these situations, but I think like after you take some time as a parent to like adjust your mindset, there's no reason to pull away from it.
And how do you guys work on your parents in terms of changing their perspectives? Do you invite them to amateur radio clubs or activities? Do they spend any time with you in the operating shack, kind of peering over your shoulder to see what you're doing? How is that working out?
I brought my parents to Dayton in 2019, and they said it was the most boring experience of their life. So they have left me alone with going to my ham fest now. So that's one thing. But they don't really understand it, but they see that it brings me joy, and so they just kind of let it happen without much questions anymore.
CJ?
I haven't brought my parents to club meetings or ham fests or anything yet, but I think what really made it click for my parents was I invited them into the shack for a few minutes with me when I did a contest probably about 8 months ago. And then I think that was when they finally realized, like, oh, this actually is very exciting for him. And I think that this is what brings him joy.
Yeah, contest really made them understand too. During a weekend, they only see me for 5 minutes every weekend during a contest because, I'm up here most of the time, and that I think brought it into perspective too.
Now, from your survey of over 100 amateur radio youth, what do you think was the greatest nugget that you guys got in terms of something that you didn't expect the answer would be?
Boy Scouts.
A lot of Boy Scouts, yeah. I mean, we know that Jamboree on the air and all that kind of stuff is a thing, but you don't. It's surprising to see how many people that actually got into the hobby.
That discovered ham radio through Boy Scouts and Jamboree on the air?
Yes.
Were either of you Boy Scouts?
I was not.
I was not.
That was a surprising thing to you in terms of the numbers?
Yeah, I was pretty surprised. That's number 2 on our list.
What's your attitude towards your own marketing of amateur radio to your peers? Do you have an approach that you make that you find more successful?
Well, of course, I have flex radios, and so I just sort of bring my laptop around to club meetings, and when there's someone young, I show them, look how cool this waterfall is and all that stuff, and they seem to really enjoy just the technology aspect of the hobby. And that's my way of doing it. Just show them all the cool stuff you can do.
Unless they actually see what's at the other end of that display. Like, do they want to come to the shack and actually see and smell the electronics in action and follow the hoses out of the back and into the backyard? Is there anything else? Because it seems to me that showing a ham radio on a laptop computer wouldn't have that same excitement.
Well, so of course I've got it's the flex radio, so I operate it remotely from the computer. So a lot of the times I'll turn up the volume and just show them, hey, this dude is talking on the radio and he is in Spain, and that sort of adds a bit of fun to it, that you're listening to a guy halfway across the world live. And so it's just, it puts, like, not names to faces, but it puts it into perspective that this is a real dude halfway across the world that I'm listening to right now on this computer.
Do you have younger siblings? And do you show them what you're doing?
Oh, no, I am the younger sibling.
Do you show it to your older siblings, Connor?
I wouldn't dare.
Really? Why not?
Because he'd make fun of me. No, he's a Marine, and he does his own radio stuff there. He gets it, but...
He gets it, but he's not there.
No.
CJ, what about you? Do you have siblings?
Yeah, I only have older siblings, and I have a sister who's not very technically inclined in that way. So I don't think she'd be interested. And I have a brother who was also a Marine and was a radio operator, so he gets the technology side of it, but he's not really interested in the hobby side of it.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. CJ, can I ask you a question? Are you a reader? Do you read books or magazines?
A little bit, not as much as I'd like.
Do you subscribe to QST? Are you a member of the ARRL?
I was a member of the ARRL. I have not renewed my subscription, but I did read on the air.
And why not?
Mostly just a matter of, I think that while they do provide a lot of resources, I really liked reading on the air. It feels like if my engagement with it is just through the magazine and the reading materials, and the membership fee becomes a lot for that.
Did you read the magazine using a computer or an iPad or something like that, or did you actually like having the paper magazine?
I was a 50-50 split. For on the air, I had that delivered, and I would read that print. I love reading that print every few months. QST I will read occasionally, and that QST is very dense in content. It's a lot of good content, but I think especially for youth and stuff, it's a lot to read through. So I would read that on a computer or tablet, and that way I can search through and flip through things a lot quicker and stuff like that.
And do you read any other magazines on any other subject?
No, not these days. I have a stock portfolio magazine that I read, and that's it.
Do you read for pleasure, books, or anything like that?
Not really, no.
Do you find that's typical of your generation?
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I think reading has sort of fallen out of fashion with most youths.
What about you, Connor? Are you a reader?
Only if it has pictures. No, I'll read every now and then, but I just find it much easier to watch a video on something than to read about it.
I see. So YouTube would be your place for variety content.
Yes.
You know, it's a different time. I remember having all kinds of magazines and my parents complaining about we're running out of shelf space.
Yeah, I have a subscription to the ARRL's magazines, and I actually haven't gotten my QST in like 3 months, so I probably should make sure I still have it. I read it every now and then, mostly when one of us are in it. We tend to make it in it because we have a great friend in the hobby, Neil Rapp, who likes to get us into all the magazines. I don't read it too much. I mostly skim the magazines, if I'll be honest with you. I just sort of flip through and look for cool stuff.
And what do you consider cool stuff?
I like some of the sort of technology things where people build like a watt meter with, that connects to your computer and they code a little display for it on the computer, or cool antenna projects that are kind of easy. I find those things pretty fun to read about.
CJ, do you have a workbench?
Sort of. I mostly just work on my desk at home. That's another thing. It's hard to find a lot of space as a youth. When you're working in a household with the whole family, you don't really have like a workshop space as much as I'd like to.
And you don't have a basement?
I do. That's also cluttered with stuff.
And when you're working on stuff, are you building any projects? Do you work with Arduinos or Raspberry Pis or anything like that?
Yeah, so I actually just built, Connor talks a lot about the Flex radios. I just built, we had another guy come up to us at Dayton and show off. He built his own DIY desktop VFO knob for Flex radios and related software-defined radios. So I've been working with him building that project. And I've also got a few QRP radios on my workbench right now. Okay,
and those are kits or are those homegrown?
Kits. So I'm building the Rockmite, if you know what that is. It's a crystal controlled. This one's for 40 meters. It's about a half a watt output. And then I have a QCX Plus Mini, which is one of those QRP lab rigs. That's 5 watts on 20 meter CW. And QDX from QRP Labs as well, which is 5 watts multi-band digital.
Right, it's pretty cool, right? It's the size of a Raspberry Pi.
Yes.
Right, you can throw it in your backpack with some wire, and I guess, would you use a smartphone with it in the field?
That's something people are experimenting with. It's becoming a new thing. There was recently a newly released app that can do FT8 on an Android smartphone. It's still a work in progress, but I've seen some people using that with the QDX, and it's pretty cool.
I think one of you mentioned, was it you, Connor, that said that you're into CW now?
Yes, I think Colin's into it too, but yeah, I'm into CW.
And what's the appeal of CW to young people?
I mean, it's kind of cool because, Morse code, but other than that, not really. It's more of a novelty thing for most youths. But for me, I'm a contester, so that's why it's appealing to me.
Yeah, I think when youths get to the point of learning CW, they're deep into contesting already.
It's more for contesting and not for maybe finding a different kind of ham on the air?
Yeah, you usually won't find many youths just rag chewing on CW, but most youths that are into CW do it for contesting or DXing.
And what's the appeal of contesting to youths?
We're very competitive.
Yeah, I think a lot of youths have sort of grown up in this, more age where every part of your school experience is about competition in sports, and you're always playing. You're like when you're in classes, you're always playing games in classes and competing. So they sort of bring that over to radio, and they say, "Oh, well, if I get on the air right now, I can probably beat 20 people on this scoreboard right now.
Are live scoreboards now available for many of the amateur radio contests so that you can actually see how you're playing in real time?
Yes.
Yes. So there's contestonlinescore.com is the big one. So I usually, whenever I'm operating a contest, I keep that open on one monitor.
Yep, me too.
Are you able to sort it by if you've got a rival, you can actually watch how your rival is doing at the same time?
Yes, you can sort call signs, you can sort by category so you can only see people in the same category as you, all sorts of cool stuff.
And from your survey, did you get a sense of how many of those over 100 respondents were involved in contesting?
I mean, not really from our forum. That was one of the other interesting things is that one of the questions on our forum was specifically, what value does amateur radio bring to you? And I was hoping to see more of a like, oh, we're pushing for, we like to be competitive and do contests and stuff like that, because in our youth program that we're a part of, we see a lot of contesters. But surprisingly, the bigger things were experimentation and meeting new people, more so over than contesting.
Now, I think perhaps we'd have the opinion that meeting new people is easier on Facebook, social media, Discord servers, things like that. And amateur radio wouldn't necessarily be about meeting new people, although I think it is. What do you think that's about? Do you think that people that are using social media tend to be in the same silo, perhaps, and therefore they don't meet new people?
I think that, but I also think a big part of this is the social media aspect. You're not just meeting people on the air, you're meeting these other youth operators in these communities that will end up having similar hobbies to you.
So amateur radio then could be viewed as a social media?
In a way, I guess, yeah.
How important is that? Is that an important perception?
I think so. I'll let Connor chime in on this, but I mean, in a sense, every hobby is about finding a community. There's not very many hobbies that are like, I just want to do this alone, right? You're always going to meet some outside person that has a similar interest to you, and becomes your friend. So I think a lot of people find amateur radio and then they search for that because they're like, oh, now I can meet people that have these same like engineering interests as me.
What do you think, Connor?
I met Colin through amateur radio. I met this crazy dude. And we have a lot of the same interests, contesting. We're both into engineering and all that. So, social media and ham radio kind of they go together. I mean, I have several personal social media accounts and then a corresponding ham radio account that goes with it as well on several of the different platforms.
As old timers, what could we do better when it comes to attracting youth to amateur radio? Who's the audience first in order to, spark the interest?
First, one of our last question was, if you could do one thing to bring youth into hobby today, what would it be? So that might be a very good question with good answers. A lot of it is just encouragement. Don't tear a youth down for trying to do something. A lot of people like to make fun of the bow things, but for kids, that's pretty much all they can afford sometimes. So just encourage what they're doing.
Well, I don't know whether my voice carries very much weight, but I carry a Baofeng radio. And the reason is when I was carrying a $300 radio and trying to navigate two dogs on the walk, dropping that $300 radio on its head and shredding the inside was a lot more painful than dropping a $25 Baofeng.
Exactly.
So I get it. I get the whole Baofeng thing. You won't hear that from me. Now, I'm getting a sense from what you're saying that, and maybe this is a social commentary, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Do you think that parents are a firewall or barrier to entry of kids getting into ham radio because of perceptions they may have about ham radio operators or the hobby or something like that?
A little bit. I remember when I was just a tech and I was studying for my general, I found a friend of a friend who had been an operator for around 60 years, who invited me down to come check out his shack and hang out. And I remember my parents being like, well, let's come with you to make sure this guy isn't a creepy old dude before we let you do this. And I think that's the first thing they think of when they think of ham radios. They think, oh, these are the same dudes that I heard about ham radio 40 years ago. So they're weird old dudes. This is a little strange for my teenage kid to be a part of.
Well, I have to tell you, 50 years ago, there were some weird old dudes, and I'm probably sure that in every generation they are. I think actually it's a good idea for parents. I put myself on a merit badge list to do electricity, electronics, and ham radio. I'm pretty determined now that any Boy Scout that's going to do that merit badge with me is going to bring a parent, and they're going to do it too, because I think that that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's just the perception of hams is a lot over exaggerated than it is. I think it's Connor might be thinking about this too, but we have a friend who we were talking to this one time about, who said when he was a kid he would go out to all these places and now he knows like the ham community is so caring about everyone that he's like, if there was a creepy old dude in the ham community. Other hams would go, like, make them stop.
There's self-policing perhaps on the ground, but not on the air?
Yeah.
Social media tends to have that same anonymity in terms of people being able to razz other people publicly.
Yeah, but I think the thing with social media is it's a lot easier to control. You can't stop someone from transmitting on the air, but say if someone comes into our Discord servers and starts harassing us, it's always easy to just click a button and get them out of there.
Yeah, as one of my good friends said, people love Facebook because you can mute people and moderate them.
I see, and you can't really do that on the air because of lack of enforcement from the authorities.
Yes, you're pretty much just out of luck if someone comes and QRMs you or something that you're on the air. You're pretty much just out of luck unless you move. But a lot of times, if you move, they show right back up.
Yeah, I know Connor was telling the story earlier about a net. And when he talked about Meme Appreciation Month, I was operating the U.S. call sign for that, which was K3K, and it was at the same time as 13 colonies. So we had a lot of people come in and think we were K2K, the 13 colony station, and they get upset when we weren't. And I was operating a huge station with a lot of power, so I had a bunch of people come in and start QRMing me, and I would spin the dial and go up like 9 kilohertz. And then they just come back because I'm the loudest signal on the band. It's hard to escape it.
Oh yeah, if you want to see some good operating practices, just look up on the DX cluster all the spots for K3K and look at the comments. It's they didn't appreciate it, and we got QRM'd very hard on the air, just because it happened to be similar to K2K. We didn't think about it being that way. It just happens to spell Kek, which is a meme.
On one of your QRZ pages, I noticed that you're operating remotely. Is that remote ham radio? And what is remote ham radio?
So remote ham radio has two sides to the story, you can say. It's a service that it's all flex radio, and there's several stations around the country and in Croatia and Puerto Rico and Haiti that people can pay for to use remotely for free. I think there's 20-something now for people to pay for. But there's another side of RHR, which is just for youth. Only youth can use the stations. And there are, 8 of those right now? And those are totally free to kids. They can use it however long they want. It ranges from one of my stations that I own is just a vertical in the backyard. And then some stations are Yagis with 1,500 watts and 2 elements on 40 meters. But kids can use that totally free for as long as they want, use it for contests, all that.
So what you're saying is remote ham radio, on the one hand, is a business, I think, that we've seen advertised in full-page ads in QST, for example. And that's so non-kids would buy an annual membership, perhaps, in order to pay by the minute to be able to operate from those stations. And on the other hand, there are people that own flex radios or other remotely controlled stations that they offer through remote ham radio that kids could also use or anyone could also use in order to have a station to talk on?
Yes, I have 2. One is my home station here, and the other one is my university. So I have 2 stations that I operate on there. Our friend Mason, who's a youth, has his home station on there. Another friend in Pennsylvania has his. and there's a few other, I guess we'll say OMs that also have their stations available for free use whenever.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Do these have to be flex radio stations in order to operate?
Yes, it's all flex radio, so you get a waterfall and all that fun stuff.
Does Flex Radio, are they sponsoring Remote Ham Radio? Because I somehow thought that there was also, maybe it's a website or something where people are remotely controlling other brands of ham radios using some common software.
So Flex Radio is partnered with Remote Ham Radio.
Because I believe probably originally that when Remote Ham Radio started, they didn't start on a Flex platform, right? They might have started on something else.
It used to be all K3. It used to be K3. Before that, it was ICOM 706 and FT2000, but that was long ago.
So this was an evolutionary process that led it ultimately to becoming a Flex platform. And then Flex obviously has that networking capability between all of the radios. And that's what's kind of making this a universal plug-and-play platform.
Yes, I think it started 2 years ago that they got their first Flex on there, and ever since then there's only Flex now, no more K3s.
And that's why Flex is your choice for both CJ and you.
Well, I had a Flex before I even knew about this program, because it's just, it's all computer-based, it's got an Ethernet connector on the back, and so it's just right up my alley. You can hack the heck out of it.
The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content. Does amateur radio, at least for you guys, and perhaps maybe this is going to have to be part of another survey, but now that you're amateur radio operators and now that you're doing kind of technical stuff, do you think that this will set a tone in terms of how your professional life will proceed, or is this just a hobby and your professional life will proceed on its own?
Definitely for me.
Definitely, yeah. I initially was planning on going into a career as a software developer, and then I found amateur radio, and now I'm actually heading off to college in 2 weeks to study electrical engineering, which was never an interest of mine before I found radio.
Where are you going, can I ask?
Yeah, University of Tulsa, out in Oklahoma.
Are you good in math?
I'm not the best. It's never been a strong suit of mine, but I think my practice with having to do calculations for radio is also helping that. So.
Oh, good. I wish you a lot of luck.
Thank you.
The only advice I can give you as an engineering school dropout is find a cluster of friends to do math problems with, and I bet you'll be successful. Yeah,
my roommate is studying computer science, so I'm hoping he'll be there for me on the math.
That sounds great. Connor, what about you? Where are you going?
I'm going to Old Dominion University here locally for the same thing.
For electronic engineering?
Electrical engineering, yes.
Okay, well, good. And if you were looking at your community, your Discord community, where you've got a lot of people that are at an age where they have to decide, which direction they might go, do you think that there's a sense that they would go in a technical direction that follows or parallels a ham radio path?
Oh, yes. A lot of them are very into and studying engineering and computer science, and especially one of them, one of our very close friends, is at Auburn right now studying something to do with the cell phone towers.
In case they want to know actually how they work?
Yes.
Or when they don't work, what to do, how they work. You already have the backup, and that's amateur radio.
Yeah.
How do your non-ham friends view your participation in amateur radio?
Oh, they have no idea.
Yeah,
I don't really talk about it much, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah, I know.
Now, is that because you've kind of narrowed your social life to amateur radio circles, or it doesn't come up in conversation?
It's just sort of a very random thing to bring up in conversation. Hey, I talk to a bunch of old people around the world on my radio. It's just something that doesn't really come up in normal conversation with friends.
But that's your perception that when you get on the air that most likely you're talking to old people on the air?
Oh yeah, most definitely. As that's the perception of most youths too.
Is old like anybody over 25? I'm kind of trying to get into your brain a little bit in terms of when you're thinking old people, what are you thinking of? What demographic are you thinking of, CJ?
Honestly, in amateur radio, in my brain, a youth is anyone under the age of like 35. It's weird in comparison to other groups, but yeah, I mean, I think most millennial age people are able to connect with us a little better. And that they're easier to talk to, but most of the time when we get on the air, we're hearing people that are at least like 50.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I think that's probably where the biggest weight is over 50.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I saw you guys in the Flex booth at the Dayton Hamvention, and there you were with 30,000 of the high priests of amateur radio, because I think that's the kind of event that attracts the high priests of amateur radio. What was your thought? Did you have any sense, looking around at the demographic, what that future holds?
Lots of scooters.
A lot of scooters, yeah. For people that are listening that didn't go to Hamvention, there was a huge tent that was renting scooters for people to get around.
Yeah, and for us, that was pretty much a big, hello. But, there's a lot of older people in the hobby, and it seems like maybe not a lot of them are getting... There's not as many new people coming in as there are older people in the hobby, right? And that's sort of a problem that needs to be fixed.
Seems to me that you guys may have the key to fixing it. When you were at Dayton, what was the most interesting thing that attracted you? What's the talking point for you about what you saw at the Hamvention?
Well, for me, I enjoyed Contest University. That was my big thing. But I enjoy seeing all the new stuff, all the cool new things that are coming out, new radios, new antennas, new software. That's what is my big thing, is all the new stuff that's, the cutting edge technology coming out.
Connor, what did you buy there?
I only bought one thing, which surprised me. I bought a Yaesu FT5.
Really? Oh, interesting.
Just because I was tired of using my super old handheld for Hamfest, and I'll be honest, I haven't touched it since the Hamfest, and I won't probably touch it until Huntsville.
Although I have to tell you, my experience at Dayton with carrying handheld radios, I would have thought that every channel would be talking. And I was surprised to listen that no channel was talking in a place like Dayton when you've got 30,000 hams that visit an area. What did I misunderstand?
There were a bunch of us youths that were working that booth. And so basically we just used our handhelds like a walkie-talkie, just to talk to each other and find out where everybody was and communicate. And we had tone squelch on, so it was just us. But that's what I think most people do at Dayton, is just to sort of keep a frequency to talk to their friends.
Yeah, I think the big problem at Dayton is you sort of run into that issue where it's like hams don't get on the air. They like to talk about radio more than they get on the air. But then you also run into, there's an event of 30,000 people and the cell service is congested. So they're using it as a replacement for their cell phone, but barely.
Well, I found that the cell service was actually quite amazing this time.
Yes, for once.
This time around is a lot better, yeah.
And we had great internet connection.
I was surprised. It was very good. It was very well done. I had a lot of fun. It makes me want to go again next year. But as I say, I had programmed into my little Linko analog dual band portable all of the repeaters in the Dayton area. And I'd kind of scroll through them, and there was no activity. I was really quite surprised. And the few times that I actually made a call, nobody came back to me. I remember amateur radio conventions years ago, and they would have been talking all the time. And maybe that's just because we have all these other alternative ways to communicate.
Yeah. Actually, we found 5.2 simplex to be much more active than all the repeaters in the area, funnily enough. We seem to get a lot more activity just talking on simplex than we did on any of the repeaters.
Yeah, every time our chauffeur for the weekend had an FTM, 400 in his car?
300, the new one.
Oh yeah. And we every time we got in there, we would call out with our we used the Flex radio call sign. We would call out on 5.2 simplex, and 9 times out of 10 we would get a reply. CJ,
what did you end up buying at the Hamvention?
I bought a lot of stuff. I always feel bad talking about it because I spent a lot of money. My focus was, because I had just done Parks on the Air with Connor, so I thought I want to get a whole POTA set up and do portable, especially with me moving out to college. So I bought, from a friend, not from the flea market, I bought a Yaesu FT450D. And then I went around to the booths. I bought a Wolf River coil and some various other components to make that setup work. And I also bought a Motorola UHF handheld for P25 experiments.
You'll certainly have to buy all the test equipment and programming gear that goes around that portable.
Yes, definitely. I'm still working on that front. I've done a couple of Parks on the Air activations with it though, and it does work great. So
I found as a kid that the first Motorola portable that I had was a Motorola HT220, and that avalanched into all kinds of gear that I had to have in order to support that. That's a slippery slope.
Definitely, yeah. The reason I got the P25 radio is because I have a buddy of mine who actually just made it his business to be a Motorola dealer, but he's big on P25 and getting business band licenses and doing encryption and all that stuff, and he sort of pushed me into it, and it is definitely a slippery hole.
From your perspective, we'll start with CJ. What do you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is now?
In terms of from a technology perspective, or in terms of a social?
From your perspective, whatever you think the greatest challenge is. If you're looking at amateur radio, either technically or corporally, what do you think is the greatest challenge that it faces now from your perspective?
I truly just think it's not enough youths. And that's why I was excited to come on here. I really think that, when we did Contest University, like Connor was talking about, we went to a presentation on, the declining age in radio, basically. And I think what was the number that Marty showed, Connor? It was like the
Not
average. It was like the average CW ops member is 60, and that number is just going up and up and up. And so I think if the hobby's going to survive, there needs to be more youth than there are today, because at the current rate, the hobby's going to die out
from its own attrition. Connor, what do you think the greatest challenge is?
So, by the way, I don't know if you probably do know this, but Colin and I literally go to Hamfest with Flex Radio to promote youth. So we see it all. But the barrier to entry seems to be a big thing. It's high cost to get into the hobby for younger people. The equipment isn't super accessible if you can't afford it. And so the price of entry, I guess, is the biggest problem right now.
Okay, and that's an initial entry.
Yes. Well, it's expensive no matter how high you go, but the initial entry is the hardest for a young person to make that jump.
And do you think a $35 license fee is a barrier to entry into a lifetime hobby? You can hear the old man in me throwing this out there that way, because when I heard this, that people were complaining about a $35 10-year license, I was kind of wondering why that was important. But what do you guys think? Do you think that a $35 license fee is a barrier to entry?
Honestly, that's a point of concern for a lot of the younger people. A lot of them can barely scrounge up the $15 for the test. And so a lot of them do have a bit of a concern about the $35. But supposedly the ARRL now offers, if you pass the test, they'll reimburse the $35. So there's at least that now.
Do kids your age and younger, do they have sources of income? I mean, do they deliver papers? I guess nobody has a paper anymore that gets delivered. But, I mean, how do kids make money these days?
I mean, honestly,
younger kids, not really. They really don't have an income. Younger kids, like 16 and younger, no.
Unless their parents give them an allowance, you're not talking basically anything. A lot of kids focus more on school than they are about going out and finding a job as soon as they can legally go work. So
now you're hearing the generation in me. Kids don't wash cars, mow lawns, babysit.
It is very rare to see.
Really?
At least in my social circles, I am one of the few that has had a job since I was 16.
Yep.
So
I'm talking about just for making money.
Yeah.
Raking leaves? $35, 50 years ago was a lot of money. $10 50 years ago was a lot of money. For some reason, it doesn't seem like a lot of money anymore, because what is a McDonald's hamburger is a Happy Meal is $12, right? Something like that.
Yeah. Well, you got to think about it. Nowadays, kids are pretty much 100% supported by their parents, so they're not even used to spending any money at all, really.
So they don't carry money in their pocket.
Yeah, if they do, it's like, hey, you're going out with your friends, here's a 20 to go buy food that their parents gave them.
Yeah.
So that means that if we're trying to create a marketing program for youth, then we probably needed to hire you guys. Is Flex Radio hiring you guys to actually understand what the marketing issues are to youth?
They don't hire us, but they do pay for all of our everything we do with them.
Are they asking about your demographic?
They ask a lot of questions about the demographic and, what interests us and all that. And, of course, they, by the way, they're hiring engineers. But, they want us to be interns, too, for their engineering department as well. So.
Okay, well, so I need to talk to Lori over there and have you guys be interns for their marketing department.
Lori is our best friend.
They're our best friend as well, I must say, on the convention side. So, and we really appreciate them an awful lot. But I'm learning a lot here because, frankly, I now have grandchildren, and the issues that they have are completely different than issues that I certainly had as a kid. And the challenges perhaps are even bigger. So what is the most fascinating thing, Connor, about amateur radio? If you were trying to make an elevator pitch about what fascinates you about amateur radio and why someone else might be fascinated by amateur radio, what would that be?
Well, I'm an interesting case. I love pretty much everything about ham radio, so it's kind of hard. But I love contesting. You can talk to people around the world. It's kind of like the, it's like sports, but for ham radio. You can see who's the best of the best, and even if you're not very good, you can still have fun, give other people points, test your equipment, test your abilities, and just have a great time all around with some friends, even if you want to go to someone else's station and be with a bunch of buddies.
CJ, what fascinates you about amateur radio, and how would you put that into an elevator pitch?
Yeah, I guess similar to Connor, but I guess the big thing is just that you can build anything you want. It's a whole hobby surrounding experimentation. If you wanted to, if you want to build an antenna, build an antenna. If you want to build a whole radio, you can do that. The possibilities are endless.
That's certainly my attitude as well. Actually, both of you have the same attitude that I have. It's just that maybe it translates differently. I'm so grateful that I ran into you at the Dayton Hamvention, and we had a chat long enough in order for us to get together and for me to be fascinated by your responses and, frankly, almost blown away from perhaps the misunderstanding that I had. I'm a generation where my kids are already in their 30s, so therefore I'm kind of not seeing on the ground what you guys are seeing. But I so appreciate that you came on the QSO Today podcast and shared this with us. So with that, I want to thank you and wish you 73s and hope that we can have another discussion like this in the future.
Yeah, we've had a great time talking with you. Thank you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Connor and CJ. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W4IPC or WW0CJ in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo returning September 17th and 18th, 2022. I am updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.